There are some memories that don't just stay with you, they shape you, reshape you, and then quietly haunt the background of everything you become. I was 10 years old the first time I realized silence could be louder than any scream. And it started the day I asked my mother why she always flinched when my father walked into the room. My name is Natalie Pierce. I'm 36 years old now, but for the longest time, I told myself my childhood was perfect. We lived in a postcard-perfect house nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac in Ashton Ridge, a sleepy Midwestern town with more trees than people, and an annual festival where the biggest excitement was watching the local high school marching band perform. My mother, Claire, was a homemaker with a soft voice and eyes that always seemed tired, like they'd been crying hours before anyone else had noticed. My father, Richard, was the golden boy of the town, a high school English teacher beloved by students, admired by parents, and respected at every town hall meeting. He had a way of telling stories that made you believe every word. He made you feel like you mattered, even when you didn't. Especially when you didn't. To me, he was everything. Confident, charming, decisive. The kind of man who could silence a room with a single raised eyebrow, and then bring it to laughter a moment later with some perfectly timed joke. I idolized him. I wanted to grow up to be like him, respected, articulate, impossible to ignore. My mother, on the other hand, was gentle to the point of invisibility. She rarely spoke up at family dinners, never raised her voice, and always made herself smaller whenever Richard was near. As a child, I interpreted her quietness as weakness. I would sit at the breakfast table watching the way she poured my father's coffee just the way he liked it, black with 1 sugar, and I would think to myself, I'll never be like her. I'll be strong like Dad. Back then, I didn't understand the difference between fear and love. It wasn't that I didn't notice things. I did. I noticed how my mother would press her lips together tightly when my father entered the room, how her hands trembled slightly when she set his dinner plate down. I noticed how she'd stop mid-laugh if she heard his footsteps coming down the hallway. But I told myself it was just her nature. She was delicate, soft, maybe a little too sensitive. She was the kind of woman who cried during pet food commercials and apologized to inanimate objects when she bumped into them. Still, sometimes I caught something in her eyes when she looked at him. A flicker of something too fleeting to name. Once, when I was about 11, I remember walking into the living room to find her staring at the window, completely still, with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. When I asked her if she was okay, she blinked as if waking from a trance and said, "Of course, sweetheart. Just tired." By 13, I had started keeping a journal. Not the glitter-covered kind that most girls my age wrote in with gel pens and stickers, but a plain, brown notebook that I kept hidden under my mattress. I didn't write about crushes or school gossip. I wrote about home. I wrote about the way my mother never seemed to meet anyone's eyes anymore, and how my father could make her disappear without ever touching her. I wrote that I hoped I would grow up to be strong like Dad, not soft like Mom. That line would come to haunt me later. One particular entry still echoes in my mind. I had come home from school early. Our history teacher had let us out after a fire alarm, and as I walked past the kitchen on my way upstairs, I heard my mother's voice. Not her usual whisper, but something sharp-edged and shaking. She was on the phone. "I can't do this anymore," she said. "He promised me he'd stop." Lena, I believed him. I really thought he meant it this time. I froze on the staircase. I didn't breathe. I don't even think I blinked. She paused. I could hear the clink of her bracelet against the phone receiver. No, I haven't told her. She adores him. She sees what he wants her to see. I backed away quietly, the carpet muffling my footsteps. I remember my heart racing, my skin hot with confusion. He promised me he'd stop. What did that mean? Stop what? My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense to me at the time. That night, I asked my father if Mom was okay. We were sitting on the back porch, just the two of us. He was drinking a beer, his legs stretched out in that easy, self-assured way of his. When I told him I'd overheard Mom talking to someone named Lena and crying, he gave a tired, half-smile and said, "Your mom's emotional, honey. She's always been that way, fragile. I try to hold things together the best I can." Then he reached over, patted my hand, and added, "You're the strong one in the family. Just like me." And I believed him. God, I believed him. The years that followed were quieter, but not calmer. My mother grew more withdrawn, her smile more brittle. She spent more time in the garden, her hands constantly dirty, like she needed something real to hold on to. My father remained the town's favorite son, shaking hands at parent-teacher conferences and charming the local librarian with his poetry readings. No one ever questioned the picture we painted. At 15, I started noticing little contradictions. A neighbor once mentioned seeing my father at the diner on a Sunday morning when he told us he was attending a school board retreat out of town. I asked him about it later, and he laughed, brushing it off with, "Oh, they must have seen someone else." I was definitely at the retreat. His tone was light, but his eyes had gone cold. I dropped it. By 16, the journal had become more detailed. I had begun tracking inconsistencies, dates, times, moods. I still loved him, but that love had started to calcify into something more cautious. I still thought of him as strong, but now that strength felt different, more like dominance than leadership. Then came my 17th birthday. It was a Saturday, and the weather had been perfect. Clear skies, crisp air, the kind of day that should have been simple and happy. My mother had made my favorite cake, a soft vanilla sponge with raspberry cream, and my friends came over for a small gathering. Everyone brought little gifts wrapped in tissue and pastel ribbons. My father stood at the grill, laughing and flipping burgers, every bit the perfect dad. But when it was time to cut the cake, he stepped behind me, placed his hands on my shoulders, and leaned in close. "You're almost a woman now," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Beautiful, just like your mother used to be." I froze. Just like your mother used to be. It was the first time his words made me feel small, not seen. I didn't know what to say. I laughed nervously, shrugged him off, and focused on the cake. But something inside me shifted that day. Something I didn't yet have the language for. That night, I sat in bed with the journal open in my lap. My handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged where my hands trembled. I wrote, "Maybe strength isn't what I thought it was. Maybe it's not about who speaks the loudest. Maybe it's about who survives the longest without being broken." I never showed that journal to anyone. Not then. Not ever. But it was there, my silent witness, my quiet rebellion. And as the years passed, I would look back on those pages and realize just how many red flags I had painted white, just how many signs I had ignored in my desperation to believe in the man I had once called my hero. By the time I left for college, I had fully convinced myself that the emotional dissonance I felt toward my mother was simply a matter of personality mismatch, some cosmic glitch that paired two people whose wavelengths were never meant to sync. It didn't occur to me, not then, that the resentment I carried like a hidden bruise wasn't truly mine, but borrowed, built slowly through years of watching how she was framed through my father's lens. I applied early decision to Columbia University, 3 states and a world away from Ashton Ridge. And when I got the acceptance letter, I remember thinking, finally, I can be somewhere I'm not just someone's daughter. The night before I moved into the dorms, my mother folded my clothes into neat piles and quietly placed lavender sachets between them, as if scent could somehow anchor me to home. I barely looked up from my phone. My father came in with pizza and told stories about his college days, regaling us with tales of spontaneous road trips and charismatic professors who changed his life. I laughed, delighted to imagine my future unfolding in similar, cinematic fashion. My mother said little. She just smiled, that same small, exhausted smile I had come to associate with her presence, a smile I once believed was weakness, and now interpreted as passivity. In those early months of school, I called home every Sunday. The conversations were short, predictable, and always directed toward my father. He asked about my classes, my friends, the city. He listened with theatrical attention, always making me feel like the most fascinating person in his orbit. If my mother answered, I would politely ask to speak to Dad, citing some homework question or fictional problem with my dorm roommate. She never protested. She never pushed. And I mistook her silence for emotional absence, rather than the careful, wounded distance of someone who had long since learned where they did and didn't belong. That Christmas, I brought home my first real boyfriend, Evan, a political science major who quoted Baldwin and knew how to command a room with subtle charm. My father adored him. He pulled Evan aside almost immediately and shared a glass of brandy with him in the study while I helped my mother finish setting the table. Claire stood across from me, arranging silverware with surgical precision, and I saw her glance toward the door where the murmur of male voices echoed through the walls. She reached out, hesitating for half a second before touching my wrist. "Natalie," she said softly, "just, don't rush anything, okay? I know what it feels like to want someone to look at you the way he does." I pulled away instinctively, heat flaring behind my eyes not from her touch but from the implication buried within it. "Mom, seriously?" I snapped, louder than I meant to. "Not everything is some tragic warning about your marriage." Her face flushed a soft pink, and she nodded without arguing, returning to the place settings like I hadn't spoken. That night, I told Evan that my mother was complicated, a word I used generously for people I didn't fully understand or didn't want to. The next summer, when I turned 21, I came home for a long weekend. My mother met me at the door with tea and an envelope. She said she'd written me something, a letter she hoped I'd read when I had time to reflect. I tucked it into my backpack and promptly forgot about it. I never opened it. I told myself it would be another guilt-soaked monologue about how she'd failed as a mother or a passive lament about how I didn't call enough. At the time, I believed that sparing myself the emotional labor of reading her words was an act of self-care. Now, I'm not so sure it wasn't cowardice. It was during that same visit that she mentioned she'd been seeing a therapist. Her tone was even, almost hopeful, as if she was trying to share something personal that might draw us closer. She encouraged me to try it too, not forcefully, just a gentle suggestion that it might help with the pressure of being so far from home. I bristled immediately, took it as a veiled critique, an insinuation that I wasn't coping well, that I was fragile like her. I smiled thinly and said I was fine, which was easier than confessing that I cried in the dorm showers sometimes just to hear the sound bounce off tile like someone answering back. When I was 22, I came home for a weekend in early spring. I hadn't planned to stay long, just a quick trip to pick up some things and appease my father, who kept reminding me that Mom misses you, even if she doesn't say it. It was during breakfast, when she reached across the counter for the honey jar, that I noticed the dark smudges on her forearm. 3 oval-shaped bruises, faded yellow at the edges but unmistakably finger-shaped. She caught me looking and pulled her sleeve down quickly. "Fell in the garden," she murmured. "Slipped on the edge of the mulch bed." She didn't meet my eyes. I didn't believe her, not really. But I said nothing. That night, my father and I shared a glass of wine while watching an old movie. He was in a buoyant mood, commenting on the lighting and the cleverness of the dialogue. I almost asked him about the bruises, almost said, "Did something happen?" But I didn't. I told myself that if something had happened, she would have told me. That if there was danger, she wouldn't still be there. That surely, she was just clumsy, just as she said. But the truth was, I didn't want to disturb the version of my father I still clung to. I didn't want to ask the question that might force me to revise the whole story I'd written about who he was, and who she was, and who I had become in their image. 2 years later, on the morning of my 24th birthday, I got a call from my father. His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual confidence. "Nat," he said, "it's your mother. It's cancer. Breast cancer. Stage 4. The room spun for a moment, and then everything went still. I flew home that weekend. The house felt smaller than I remembered, and colder, even though it was July. Claire was thinner, quieter, her hair grayer than I remembered, her eyes dull from fatigue and something else I couldn't name. She smiled when she saw me, and I kissed her cheek with more hesitation than I wanted to admit. I didn't cry, not then. Not in front of her. My father did, though. He wept at the kitchen table while she sipped tea with both hands around the mug like she was holding something precious and fragile and vanishing. Watching him cry was the most surreal experience of my life. He'd always been so composed, so in control. But now, with tears cutting lines through his stubble, he looked almost boyish. And I hated that I still felt closer to him than I did to her. I stayed 2 nights before returning to New York. When I left, she handed me another envelope. Another letter I didn't open. I told myself I was too busy. I told myself I already knew what she'd say. But the truth was, I couldn't bear to read her words while she was still alive, still looking at me with hope, like maybe there was something left to mend. Because part of me had already decided that some things couldn't be rewritten. And part of me, though I didn't understand it yet, was beginning to wish I was wrong. The morning of the funeral broke with a kind of artificial brightness that felt almost insulting, as if the universe had the gall to keep functioning normally while my mother lay cold and breathless in a lacquered box beneath a linen-draped casket. The sky was too blue, the air too crisp, and every small bird call outside my hotel room window felt like a personal affront to the heaviness in my chest. I had arrived in Ashton Ridge the night before, stepping into my childhood town as if through a dream stitched together by equal parts nausea and muscle memory. The street signs hadn't changed, nor had the neat sidewalks or the perfectly spaced trees, but something had twisted in the air, an invisible shift, as if the town knew it was now missing one of its quietest, most loyal occupants. I hadn't stayed at the house. I couldn't. My father was still living there, in the same colonial where I had grown up and where my mother had, by all accounts, wasted decades of her life waiting to be noticed, understood, or maybe just allowed to breathe freely. Instead, I had checked into a small and just outside town, the kind of place with a pot of fresh coffee in the lobby and floral wallpaper that hadn't been updated since 1987. I didn't sleep much. The bed creaked every time I moved, and my thoughts were restless, turning over her name like a stone with too many sharp edges. Claire. My mother. Gone. The church was already full when I arrived, black-clad figures shifting politely in pews, murmuring condolences, some of them touching my shoulder with the gentle reverence reserved for tragedy. I wore a black dress I'd bought just after the diagnosis, when I'd already known how the story would end but hadn't wanted to admit it aloud. My father stood near the front, solemn-faced and tight-lipped, accepting handshakes and hugs like a dignitary presiding over a diplomatic funeral. He didn't cry. He looked tired but composed, the grieving husband made palatable for public consumption. I sat several rows back, alone, surrounded by people I once knew but no longer recognized. And then I saw her. She stood just inside the church doors, tall and dignified, with silver streaks in her dark hair and a quiet confidence that somehow made everyone near her step back slightly, as though her presence demanded more space than she took. She wasn't dressed like the rest. No black veil or tear-soaked tissue in hand, but instead wore a navy coat with delicate embroidery, something that looked handmade and worn with meaning. Our eyes met, and there was a flicker of something, recognition, maybe, or sorrow too old to be fresh. She walked toward me slowly and extended a hand. "You must be Natalie," she said softly, her voice like velvet just starting to fray at the edges. "I'm Lena. Your mother's friend." The way she said it, friend, felt carefully chosen. Not casual, not cold, but heavy with implication. "My mother's friend?" I repeated, standing slowly. "She mentioned you sometimes. She talked to you a lot, I think." Lena's eyes were kind, but there was something else too, something hesitant. She glanced toward the front of the church, where my father stood stiffly beside the closed casket. "I was more than just her friend," she said, her voice lower now, almost reverent. "We were very close, for a long time. Your mother and I." She paused, swallowed, and tried again. "Claire trusted me. And she wanted you to have something." Before I could respond, my father turned and saw her. His expression changed so quickly and so violently that it startled me, a flash of pure venom before he buried it behind a mask of thin politeness. "Lena," he said, his voice clipped and dry. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm sure you didn't," she replied, not smiling. "But I promised Claire I would be." They didn't shake hands. The tension between them was thick enough to taste. I glanced between them, feeling like a child again, confused in a room full of whispered meanings and half-told truths. After the service, we gathered at the gravesite. I stood apart from most of the mourners, watching as the casket was lowered into the ground, dirt sliding over the polished surface like silence reclaiming space. My father gave a brief eulogy, full of lofty language and flowery metaphors about love and strength. I listened without hearing him, the words bouncing off my skull like stones skipping water. Later, as people trickled away and the sun dipped lower in the sky, Lena approached me again. We stood under a sycamore tree, just out of earshot of the remaining guests. She held out a worn envelope, the kind that had been opened and refolded a dozen times. "These are from your mother," she said. "She wrote them over the years. Some were written before you were even born. Others were added more recently. She made me promise I'd give them to you. Not while she was still here. She didn't want you to feel obligated. She wanted you to be ready." I took the envelope with numb fingers. It was thick, heavy, clearly filled with more than just one letter. I opened my mouth to ask something, anything, but Lena simply nodded once, gently touched my shoulder, and walked away. That night, I sat on the bed in the small inn, the envelope on my lap like a heartbeat I was afraid to check. I stared at it for a long time before finally opening it. The first letter was dated 1995, the year I turned 7. Her handwriting was neat, slanted, the ink slightly faded. "Natalie, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to tell you these things in person. I hope you know how much I loved you, even when I wasn't the mother you needed. There are things I never said, things I couldn't say. But you deserve to know them. You deserve to know the truth." There were 12 letters in total. I read every one. And by the time I finished, the version of my life I had clung to for decades had collapsed entirely. My father, the man I had adored, the man I had idolized, had been emotionally and physically abusive from the beginning. He controlled everything: money, conversations, perceptions. He had threatened her the first time she tried to leave, telling her he'd ruin her, take me away, tell the town she was mentally unstable. She had stayed, she wrote, because she believed a daughter needed both parents. She had tried to protect me from the worst of it, even if it meant sacrificing herself completely. The bruises were real. The silence was strategic. The flinches weren't imaginary. And Lena had been more than her friend. They had fallen in love slowly, gently, through letters and glances and stolen afternoons. But my mother couldn't leave. Not with my father holding the bank accounts, the mortgage, the community's unwavering trust. She had told no one but Lena. I didn't cry while I read. I sat still, shaking, gutted by a grief so layered I couldn't even name it properly. It wasn't just the loss of my mother, it was the loss of every belief I had built around her. Around myself. She hadn't been weak. She had been imprisoned. And I had judged her from the outside of a cell she never asked to be in. I thought I knew who she was. I thought I knew who I was. But I was wrong. About everything. And now, with her gone, I wasn't sure how I'd ever make it right. There is a particular kind of grief that doesn't cry out. It seeps in slowly, like water through a cracked foundation, quiet and insidious, until one day you realize your entire sense of reality is resting on rotted beams. After the funeral, I didn't return to New York right away. I stayed in Ashton Ridge, not because I found comfort there, but because I couldn't look away from the wreckage I had finally been forced to see. My childhood home now felt like a museum of curated lies, each room a shrine to a version of my parents that had never actually existed. I couldn't bring myself to enter my old bedroom the first week. Instead, I began combing through boxes in the attic, ones my mother had labeled in careful cursive with words like spring keepsakes and school projects. Buried beneath the expected photo albums and macaroni art, I found the real treasure, the journals. 8 in total, each bound in worn leather or spiral binding, filled cover to cover in her neat, slanted handwriting. The earliest dated back to the year I was born, the latest one ending abruptly 6 months before her death. It took me days to read them. I had to take breaks, not because they were difficult to read in a literal sense, but because every page unspooled another quiet revelation that unraveled everything I had once believed. Her voice in those pages was not soft or uncertain. It was sharp, self-aware, often darkly funny in a way I had never attributed to her before. She wrote about the fear, of course, the bruises, the gaslighting, the loneliness, but she also wrote about me. About how much she loved me, how she stayed for me, how she watched me pull away year after year and convinced herself that it was worth it if it meant I would never feel like a burden. She wrote about Lena too. About how their friendship had begun over shared book recommendations and late-night phone calls, then evolved into something deeper, something both terrifying and beautiful. She never once used the word affair. She used the word sanctuary. Reading those pages, I began to understand what love looks like when it's forced to grow underground, how it becomes both more fragile and more fierce. When I finally sat down across from my father, it was a Saturday morning and the house still smelled faintly of my mother's lavender cleaning spray. He sat with his usual posture, back straight, eyes clear, and met my gaze without flinching. "I found Mom's journals," I said, my voice hoarse from the sleepless nights. His expression didn't change. He leaned back slightly in his chair and let out a sigh that sounded almost rehearsed. "I see," he said after a moment. I imagined she had quite a bit to say. "She documented everything," I continued. "The threats, the control, the bruises, how you kept her trapped here." His brow furrowed in what I can only describe as insulted disbelief. "Natalie, your mother was not well, especially in those last few years. She had a tendency to exaggerate. She always did. Emotional instability runs in her family, you know that." I stared at him, feeling something in my stomach twist painfully. "She wasn't unstable. She was terrified. Of you." He gave a short, bitter laugh, the kind that made my skin crawl. "Terrified of me? Because I asked her not to spend money recklessly? Because I tried to keep this family together when she was running off with that woman, Lena, whatever her name is?" I didn't recognize his voice anymore. Or maybe I did, and I was only now hearing it clearly, stripped of the illusions I had always wrapped it in. "You controlled everything," I said quietly. "The money, the house, her reputation. You made sure she had nowhere else to go." "She had plenty of choices," he snapped. "She just didn't want to face the consequences of her actions." She was in love," I interrupted, my voice shaking now. "And you made her feel like that was a crime." His eyes narrowed, a warning flickering across his expression like a storm cloud. "Don't rewrite history, Natalie. Your mother had a habit of rewriting things when they didn't go her way. And Lena took advantage of her vulnerability. It was manipulative, not love." I left that day with my hands shaking and my heart feeling like it had been carved open with a scalpel. That night, I called a therapist in New York and booked an appointment for the following week. I didn't care about the wait list. I needed to start peeling back the layers of damage that I now realized had been with me for years, long before I had any name for them. Therapy didn't offer quick relief. It was slow, excruciating work. I sat week after week in a small office with soft lighting and carefully curated calm, confronting the fact that I had spent most of my life mistaking control for love and equating silence with weakness. I had vilified my mother's stillness because I didn't understand it. Because I had been taught, subtly, consistently, that only loudness meant power, that charisma was truth, and that survival was measured by how much space you could command in a room. I began re-examining everything. The family dinners where she barely spoke. The way she always had her hands busy when my father was home, folding napkins, adjusting curtains, refilling drinks she hadn't touched. The vacations she forgot to join us on. The way she looked at the floor when I came home with stories about how wonderful my dad was, how cool my professors thought he was when he visited campus. And the prenup. God, the prenup. I found the papers buried in the back of the home office filing cabinet, wrapped in a manila envelope marked archived. It wasn't just a prenup, it was a trap. It had clauses that gave my father total control over all jointly acquired property, full custody of any children in the event of divorce, and even language that allowed him to appoint mental health evaluations if he suspected emotional instability. My mother had signed it just 3 days before their wedding. In her journal, she wrote that she had considered backing out that night but had convinced herself it would all change after the vows. It never did. When I filed a civil suit disputing my father's sole control over Claire's estate, it wasn't about money. It was about truth. It was about visibility. It was about finally standing up in court and saying, she mattered. She had a voice. And we silenced her for too long. The community didn't see it that way. Most of them sided with him, of course. Richard Pierce, the charming teacher, the widower trying to grieve with dignity while his ungrateful daughter dredged up painful stories and aired family laundry in public. Some people sent emails urging me to reconsider. Others simply stopped speaking to me. But I didn't care. Because for the first time, I was finally learning to speak, not for the father I had idolized or the town that wanted comfort over truth, but for my mother, for myself, for the woman I had never truly seen until she was already gone. By the time I turned 30, I had finally stopped flinching at the sound of my father's voice in old voicemails I'd never had the nerve to delete. I had stopped waking from dreams that placed me back in our quiet Ashton Ridge kitchen, watching my mother slice vegetables in silence while my father recited stories like monologues, his voice filling every space while hers disappeared into the corners. The dreams no longer ended in panic but instead in stillness, a recognition of the ghost of the life I had once mistaken for love. The woman I had become by 30 wasn't entirely healed, but she was no longer haunted. I lived in Boston now, in a brick apartment lined with second-hand bookshelves and chipped mugs that I refused to replace, because they reminded me that imperfection was still function, and function was still beautiful. My work had taken root in advocacy, in rebuilding, first with a small nonprofit shelter for women escaping domestic violence, and eventually with a statewide coalition aimed at expanding policy protections and legal support for survivors. I didn't start this work out of guilt, although for a long time, I feared that was my fuel. I started because one morning I woke up and realized that if my mother had felt safe enough to leave, her story would have looked very different, and so would mine. I met James on a foggy Tuesday morning during a community outreach panel. He was quiet but not distant, thoughtful without performance, and asked questions in a way that made people want to answer. We didn't rush into anything, which was new for me. He didn't love bomb or overpromise. He didn't try to fix me when I hesitated to open up about the things I used to romanticize as complicated childhood stuff. Instead, he sat with me. He listened. And one day, over coffee and silence, I realized I trusted him. Not blindly, not desperately, but consciously, which felt like the most radical kind of love I'd ever known. At 32, I created the Claire Pierce Legacy Fund, a small but growing scholarship program for women who had survived domestic abuse and were ready to return to school, restart careers, or reclaim pieces of themselves they had been told were irretrievable. I used the settlement money from the civil case, what little the court could pry from my father's meticulously layered finances, and matched it with donations I'd gathered over the years. Each year, we awarded 5 scholarships. Each year, I read their applications with tears and awe. And every year, I wrote each woman a letter, reminding them they were never as alone as they had been made to feel. That fall, I heard from my mother's cousin, Joyce, someone I barely remembered from family reunions blurred by potato salad and whispered judgments. She reached out quietly, cautiously, through a Facebook message. She told me she'd read about the fund in the local paper and that she was sorry. She said she'd always suspected something was wrong in the house on Marigold Lane but hadn't known what to do. Her voice wasn't defensive, it was heavy with regret. Over the next months, more came. An old neighbor. A former student of my father's. Even my 5th grade teacher, who confessed she remembered the look on Claire's face during parent conferences but never connected it until much later. I didn't absolve them. I didn't accuse them either. I simply let their honesty sit between us, unjudged, because silence had already stolen enough from us all. When the phone rang on a Thursday morning in October and the voice on the line said my father had died of a heart attack in his study, I felt nothing. No sharp grief, no release. Just a curious, floating detachment, as though someone had told me a historical figure had passed, relevant, perhaps, but unrelated to the life I was now living. The funeral was planned in the same church where we'd buried my mother, by the same minister who had called her devoted and graceful, even as the eulogy ignored everything that had bruised her into quietness. I didn't go. Instead, I drove to the cemetery just outside Ashton Ridge and sat on the bench beside my mother's grave, the stone simple and unadorned save for her name, the years of her life, and a line of poetry I had chosen from one of her journals. She grew roots in silence and bloomed without permission. I read aloud to her that day, not a speech, not a prayer, but one of her own poems, handwritten and slightly torn at the edges, folded between the pages of her final journal. To endure is not to vanish, to stay is not to consent. Some flowers open only in shade, some songs are sung in whispers, when the world is too loud to listen. The wind caught the last line and carried it like a blessing. I closed my eyes and breathed her in, not the memory of her suffering, but the quiet, luminous dignity of her survival. She had lived in a house where every breath was borrowed, and still she had found the will to write. Later that night, I sat by the window of my Boston apartment, the letter she had once given me trembling in my hands. I had kept it all those years, unread. Always waiting for the right moment, always afraid there wouldn't be one. But something had shifted now. The story was mine to finish. I opened it. Her handwriting was the same, neat, precise, a little more tired than in her journals. Natalie, if you're holding this, then something in your heart has opened. Maybe it hurts, maybe it burns, maybe it confuses you. But it's open, and that means you are alive in a way I never had the chance to be. You don't have to forgive me. I wouldn't ask that of you. But I hope you see me now, not as a weak woman, not as a cautionary tale, but as someone who endured. Someone who loved you in silence, and sometimes wrongly, and often invisibly, but with every breath I had left. You are stronger than I ever was, and that is how I know I did something right. I held the letter to my chest and wept, not because she was gone, but because, at last, she was seen. The following spring, I published an essay in The Atlantic. It was titled, What I Learned About Love at My Mother's Funeral. It wasn't about vengeance or accusation. It was about truth. It was about how love that demands silence isn't love, it's power. It was about how women like my mother lived lives that were never fully spoken aloud. And it was about the daughter who finally found the voice to speak for her. The last line read, I didn't inherit her silence. I inherited her strength. And now, I use it to speak.